Well, welcome in LSU fans. As my name's Bryce, Koon alongside Glen West. And Glen, we were just joking. We were just talking about, we can't go too far on this LSU beat without some type of news. And I guess for a lot of people, maybe the month of February was just not newsworthy enough. Obviously, baseball kicking up. I'm in Frisco right now, getting ready for what should be an interesting weekend. But the football team said, "Hey, I know we start spring practice, but let's get some news into the headlines." Bo Davis leaves LSU, headed to the New Orleans Saints under Kellen Moore's new staff down there. And so, Glenn, it's kind of funny. Well, I guess maybe I don't know if it's funny for a lot of Saints and LSU fans. It's like, hey, we just got a really good D line coach. But if you're an LSU fan, you just lost the D line coach, and the revolving door continues. So, obviously, some breaking news that happened yesterday. I want to talk about it. So, without further ado, Glenn, just kind of what was your immediate reaction to the actual move? Seems like on social media, when you look around, it's just, hey, here we go again at the defensive line position.
Yeah, pretty surprising that this is kind of what happened. 13 months after Bo Davis was hired to be the defensive line coach, it was considered at the time to be a pretty huge coup for Brian Kelly and bringing him on board. I think they had tried a number of times in previous years and just hadn't been able to make it work. And so you're making that move and you're making that hire and you're giving that kind of contract out to Bo Davis, thinking like, okay, this could be a long-term solution to a position group that's been turned over so many times here over the last 5 years. I mean, they're now going to be working on their eighth defensive line coach to coach those tackles since 2020, which is what true freshman Jacobian Guillory has had to deal with since he was back there as in 2020 as a true freshman. So that's a lot of turnover there at that one position group. Obviously, I think the initial reaction was just a little bit of surprise and but I think when you peel back the leaves, peel back the onion a little bit more here, you can see why a coach like Bo Davis, who spent so much of his career building relationships and recruiting at a high level and developing at a high level, why the last couple of years, particularly with how recruiting has shifted, and it's been a pretty sizable shift, and you could see why he maybe would want to just go focus on coaching and being the coaching side of the defensive line and not having to deal with all of the ancillary pieces that come with recruiting these days. So
Yeah.
it's not a huge shock in terms of just why someone would want to do that, why a coach that's been in college on and off for the last 30 years would want to find some find a place where he can develop and focus on the technical side of things, which is what he's going to be doing in New Orleans. And, he's one of the best at it. So very, it's a hit for LSU. It's a gain for the Saints fans out there. But certainly now, if you're Brian Kelly, you've got a lot of work to do here in a short amount of time of trying to put together a list and trying to find somebody else that can come in and hopefully stay a little while. I mean, I think that's probably priority
Yeah.
number one for me is if I'm Brian Kelly, first question out of my mouth is, how long do you want to be here? Like, is this a long-term deal for you? Like, do you feel like this could be a situation where you'd want to stick around for a few years and help build some chemistry and camaraderie in that room?
Yeah, and I think you bring up a great point with just the consistency and having a guy, and we'll get into it here in a second with the guys currently on the roster, and then obviously recruiting and how it affects that. But I think you bring up a great point when you just talk about just the year over year and making sure you have a guy that wants to be a part of the here and now. Now, look, that's not a diss at Bo Davis and what the opportunity he has to go do. I mean, hey, go coach in the NFL, like you mentioned. We got a glimpse of Bo Davis last spring and in the fall camp, just kind of up close watching him coach, Glenn. And I would just label him as he's just a football coach. And he wants to be a part of, like what you mentioned, the technique and teaching guys. And he wants to be that. And in today's day and age of college football, it's just another notch in the belt of a coach who's probably a really good football coach that doesn't want to get burnt out on the NIL recruiting sphere and wants to coach football. And look, in the NFL, he doesn't have to worry about stuff like that. That's the front office's job. So I'm right there with you. I mean, this is a loss for LSU. It's a loss for some of the guys that he developed, and we kind of saw some of the responses. I know Ahmad Bro was a guy that had grown really close with Bo Davis, and was just one of those guys that obviously when we go back and talk with Bro and you talked with Kelly, like Bro and Davis hit it off because he's like, hey, I'm going to give up anything I want and be a part of the team. And Davis obviously helped him mold him into what was an interior defensive lineman there as well. But I kind of wanted to take this angle with it and get your thoughts on it because I think the next thing that you have to do, and the next thing you may be concerned about, and it's not no, we're not picking up obviously any intel as of right now that this could happen, but naturally your thought has to be, okay, when that spring portal window opens up, are there any guys that committed to what Bo Davis wants? And if LSU hasn't made a move or they have made a move, when that happens, you kind of have to sit there and wonder, is this defensive line room going to look different as we enter spring ball than it will enter into summer and into fall? And so I think that's kind of the next step is if LSU doesn't make that hire immediately, or even if they do, and it's a guy who has maybe a different outlook and didn't recruit these guys, there could be potentially some attrition in the room that I think we felt, maybe I don't want to speak for you, kind of felt like, hey, guys got to develop there. But from a numbers perspective, you were getting back to where you needed along the defensive line, especially that interior group.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that that core group is going anywhere. Like, I mean, Dominic McKinley, Ahmad Bro, Jacoby and Guillory, those guys are kind of at the top, and I think that's kind of solid. Like, I mean, obviously, those defensive linemen, those defensive tackles are going to be very passionate in the immediate reaction to all this. But I
Hmm.
think once you kind of get into spring ball and you get into like the flow of things, um, communication is going to be extremely important with all those players. And, I think probably in the short term, what you're going to see is a guy like Kevin Peoples, who has experience coaching the entire defensive line. In his past, he's been focusing on edge rushers and defensive ends the last couple of years of his career. But he can be a good short term answer in terms of just getting
Hmm.
everybody in the same room, all the guys on the same page, and knowing and kind of displaying that message that LSU is going to bring somebody in here that can develop you guys. Like, that's not going
Yeah.
to be a problem. We're going to be able to go out there and lure a really talented technician, a really talented developer, and then go from there. But I think it's really important that like I mentioned, that communication is there from day one. And from what we understand, they had a nice team meeting, or they had a defensive line meeting. Pretty much as the news was breaking or right after the news was breaking. So, they tried to inform the players in that respect. But at the end of the day, yeah, I mean, could there be a little bit of attrition with some of the guys that just climbed on board? For sure. Like, I mean,
Hmm.
you can't ever rule that out. I mean, they have 4 freshman defensive tackles that they just signed in the 2025 class. You're not going to lose all 4 of them or anything like that, but could one maybe go somewhere else? Maybe. We'll see kind of how it all shakes out in the spring and what kind of the intel is coming out of the spring of where guys are in the pecking order. And you also just brought in Sadir Mitchell from Texas, who was obviously very close with Bo Davis, and that's an obvious tie right there, direct link
Hmm.
as to why he was somebody that was targeted. So maybe you see 1 or 2 guys jump ship, but I think at the end of the day, this is still going to be a very deep room in terms of numbers. I mean, right now, I believe you're right at like 8 or 9 defensive tackles when you're figuring in all the additions from this last year. You got Sean Washington back as well to kind of mix in with that core group I mentioned earlier. So, it's a sting, it's a loss for sure of losing Bo Davis. I don't want to sugarcoat that at all. Like, I mean, we had to hammer that out right at the beginning there because
Yeah.
he is definitely one of the more respected college defensive line coaches and recruiters that was out there. So, how you go about replacing that? I mean, there's only a very short list of guys that are at or near the level of Bo Davis. So it's going to be very interesting to see the pool of applicants that kind of surfaces here over the next 72 hours or so, and we'll see kind of where Brian Kelly ultimately goes with this hire. But yeah, it's the most important thing for me right now is communication with the players and making sure that they have their ducks in a row for the spring, because this is a roster still that has playoff aspirations, it has championship
Yeah.
aspirations, and you can't really have a weak link right now in the chain. Like, you've got to have everybody solely focused on developing and getting better, and using these next several months to the best of their advantage.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of the frustration part that I saw kind of surrounding social media and a little bit of our message board was like, man, like you went and spent all this money in the portal, you really went after it, and you felt like, okay, year two under Blake Baker, year two with his staff and Bo Davis, and then it just kind of feels like can you catch a break? You know what I mean? Like, especially like if you're an LSU fan, now, I'm not gonna say the staff can't catch a break. It's their job. They're paid the money to go do what they have to do. But just from a fan's perspective, I think it's God, can we just catch a break on just having some continuity year over year and being excited about the potential of year two in the same with the same coach at the helm? So I think all those are great points. And like you said, I don't think it's going to be a free fall, but I think it'll be interesting to see some of the conversations about who's hired and things like that. So let's take it that
I
direction
mean,
real quick. 'Cause then,
I'll just say
go ahead.
this real quickly. I mean, the one thing about that defensive tackle room, we think there's some talent on there, but there's not a whole lot of experience. And so a guy
Yeah,
like Bo Davis was going to be extremely important in getting those young guys who had some of that experience last year, like a Bro, like a McKinley, Guillory when he gets back. He's obviously the most veteran, experienced player in that room, but he's coming off of a serious Achilles injury, and we don't know when he's going to be back. So I think Brian Kelly told the Advocate that Guillory's going to do some small individual drill type things during spring ball, but he's not going to be, contact or anything like that. So we'll see kind of how he progresses, but it's a hit from the perspective of you need somebody in here that's going to be able to develop these guys in a short amount of time because there's just not that 2-3 year veteran that started a bunch of games in that interior. And that's the one part of this defense that I think you can still look at and say, where's the prove it? Where's that,
yeah.
that past, production in terms of SEC or just any kind of college production. They have some of those players that just haven't really had a whole lot of games under their belt. So it'll be interesting to see how that all transpires this offseason as well.
Yeah, I think that's the biggest piece for me is that it's not that you don't think that you have the talent on paper. I mean, I'll be real. I don't think that the talent is necessarily where it needs to be a championship team, like, what you just saw Ohio State do, a couple weeks ago and a month or two ago. But I think that what you said is very true is that you have guys that could be that, and Bo Davis felt like the perfect fit to help them bridge that gap and get there. And we talked about that going into last season, and we'll have to see. I mean, it's going to be interesting. So I did want to talk about this though because I know you wrote a piece on it. Sonny has kind of floated some stuff out there. So if you want the full scope of it, make sure you pick up that Go 24/7 subscription, and you can join the community and join the conversation about it. But Glenn, obviously some way too early names being thrown around, not a lot of concrete stuff to this, just in terms of where you go. And I did want to say this too is pretty interesting because I saw some people saying it feels like it's so late in the cycle. And I talked with a coach last night who recently moved schools. He's now moved over to the ACC, and we were talking about just the coaching, the cycle of how it's moved and everything with the portal and everything. Like it feels like coaches are getting picked up and leaving later in the cycle. And I think if you're an LSU fan worried about where you are in terms of a hiring cycle, look at what just happened to Texas. I mean, you lose your DB's coach. He's now Terry Joseph is going to head to New Orleans as well. So Texas had some attrition late in this cycle. It's not the end of the world. I think if you go back 5, 10 years ago, looking your D line coach in a couple days from March wasn't ideal, and it's still not ideal, but it's not the end of the world with the landscape of college football we're in. But Glenn, there's some names early out there. I know one that's been thrown around a lot is Eric Henderson. Obviously has ties to the state of Louisiana, being paid handsomely out there on the West Coast. Some familiar names as well. And I don't want to spoil it because I want people to go kind of read the content. So make sure you check it out. But just in a general sense, Glenn, how do you think Brian Kelly attacks this? Because I think this is one where if you're Scott Woodward, you're Brian Kelly, this is a very important hire that you're about to make. Like very important. And you have to get it right. Just in terms of the aggressiveness and how much this needs to be right. How important is this hire to get this right if you want to be in that 12-team playoff with what we've kind of discussed about the inexperience along that defensive line?
Yeah, it is important, and I think it's nice that you have somebody like a Kevin Peoples here in the short term that can
Hmm.
help maybe bridge that gap until you do find the right hire, and whether that comes in the next 7 days or it comes a couple weeks into spring ball, all that's still to be determined. But I think probably from an LSU perspective, the one thing that you have seen them do and pretty much consistently under Brian Kelly is that they're going to pay coaches. Like they're going to go
Yeah.
out and they're going to find the best and they're going to try to bring them in here. And look, I think Bo Davis was making what 1.25 million a year at LSU as a
Hmm.
position coach. That money is still there. I mean, it doesn't just go away. Like, I mean, they have those funds to pay the next guy, and it's just about finding that short list of candidates that you feel like is worth that kind of contract, and maybe a candidate that is not going to, or at least, I mean, it's hard to know a year ahead of time, but a candidate that you feel like you can be able to keep around for a little bit longer than just a year or two. So that's all going to be a part of the decision making process that Brian Kelly's going to have to talk about with Scott Woodward and certainly with any candidates that they bring in for that position. You mentioned Henderson there. He would be, I think, the gold standard. I don't know how realistic that is to
Yeah.
go out and to California and grab him from the West Coast, but he does have those New Orleans ties, and I think he would be the slam dunk hire that's out there. That's right now in the coaching world or in the college coaching world. So, and then the other thing you got to consider too is, guys that or maybe coaches at the LSU or at the NFL level who are maybe let go from their positions that are maybe out there still
Yeah.
looking for jobs as well. Like I don't know if there's any defensive line coaches out there that are still searching for work or that were in the NFL the last several years that Brian Kelly has connections with, but that might be another avenue else you could look to go as well. And then I think probably the in terms of qualities that you're looking for, I know recruiting is extremely important, and don't get me wrong, that's a big part of what you want to do in terms of making a hire. But to me, the most important thing for the immediate term is to find a coach that's going to be able to connect with these players, relate with them, develop them, and get them ready for this season. Because the way LSU has operated since December or since the 2024 regular season ended, it's been about
Yeah.
2025 and building a roster that is competitive enough to compete at the level that LSU expects to compete at, and that's playoff and championship level. Like that's
Yeah.
what they have poured a ton of resources into since the end of December, and we'll see kind of what that where that leaves LSU in terms of development of the other positions, but in terms of defensive tackle, that's a huge gaping hole right now because you have to have somebody in there that's good at developing talent, can pick up where Bo Davis left off, and get these players in the right frame of mind and the right positions to be successful on the interior because LSU has to get better on the run. We know that from last year. That's not just on the interior guys; it's also on the linebackers and the safeties, but those interior guys and the space they're able to eat up is a big part of that as well. And so they have to go out there and get a coach that's technically really good at developing talent. And that's where I would certainly lay a lot of my eggs in that basket if I was Brian Kelly and making this decision.
And I think a great, parlaying this into the next and the final topic of conversation here is how does it affect recruiting, Glenn? And I was kind of going back and looking at this last night, and you know, I want to be respectful of who's in that defensive line room. But I think when you just look at the pure recruiting rankings, LSU hasn't lit it up. They haven't lit it up. It's in terms of interior defensive talent. Like that is a premium position both in the portal and in the high school ranks. Like guys who are ready to go, they cost a pretty penny, and you have better been recruiting them for years in terms of the relationships you have. And so, Bo Davis was really great. And one of the calling cards when he came to LSU was, hey, he could take the three-star talent and develop it into first-round talent. You saw that with the two interior guys that Texas had drafted last year. And I think that that was kind of the semblance that you got out of the class in terms of, you didn't get a Jakeem Stewart, but you got, Brandon Brown, you got Zion Williams, like you got some guys that felt like, hey, they fit the mold of what you want. You got to develop and take them there. And so I think from a recruiting perspective, Glenn, and this is not just on Bo Davis, LSU's kind of missed out a little bit in terms of getting that elite high five-star talent in the interior of the defensive line. I think that's something that has to be kind of looked at too. Is like at some point you got to kind of get back to really being truly in the competition. I know the landscape has changed. LSU's up their NIL. You mentioned that, the focus on 2025, but I was kind of going back and look at it and like, you got Zion Williams, you got Dylan Battle, you have Brandon Brown. Funny enough, obviously, some of the notes on Carius Kern, it'd be kind of interesting to see if he could move some people around on the defensive side of the football with the way he's
Yeah.
been showing out. But just in terms of the recruiting sphere, how does this affect? Well, that's one side of things. But I'll tell you, every single recruit I've talked to, Kevin Peoples is very well respected, both as a on the field coach and as a recruiter. So until then, if Kevin Peoples, like you mentioned, is the guy these kids are meeting with, especially during spring visit season, I feel good. Like, and maybe that's internal optimist. I don't know, Glenn, but I feel good about just from what I've heard about Peoples. We go back to the press conference, what Braden Swinson, Savion Jones just talked about what he was as a man. So from a recruiting perspective, yeah, LSU hasn't been landing that high 5-star talent. They've been landing guys that have promise and can develop. But I think that with Kevin Peoples and whoever they bring in next, like it also kind of lays the groundwork of like, okay, you kind of got to get back to maybe landing some of these big names and these big guys that are massive. I don't want to say just guys that take up space, like some big dudes that can hold their own and be disruptors, and those guys that could be an All SEC second or third team as a freshman. I know those don't grow on trees, but Glenn, you've been around the LSU beat longer than I have. That's what LSU fans and that's what an LSU defense is accustomed type of guys they're type of bringing in those playmakers, those guys that can be difference makers there early on in their careers.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, to your point about the recruiting, like, I mean, they had, Don McKinley just signed. He was a 5-star in the 2024 class, and they have some success in getting, those kinds of players on board over the last couple of years. But really, after McKinley, you're right. It's a lot of 3-star talent you're having to develop, over time. And, I think that was, like you mentioned, I think he used the word calling card on Bo Davis. That was his calling card as a coach, was that he could take that, high 3-star talent and make him a high draft pick in the NFL in 3 or 4 years time. But LSU really doesn't have that 3 or 4 years time right now. Like they've got
Yeah.
to be able to find a coach right now that I think can develop these guys immediately. And that's waving a magic wand over this to some degree. I understand that, and you can't really predict what that's going to look like 5 months from now. But I really just come back to how important the development angle is of all this, and how important it is for this current construction of the roster to feel like they're being developed and getting better over the course of the next 5 months before September gets here and that first game at Clemson hits us. So
Hmm.
I agree that recruiting is important. You have a number of guys in this upcoming class that are huge, hugely
In
important to
state
the
too.
future. Yeah, in state, whether it's Lamar Brown or Dylan Berryman or Darius McKinley, there's several guys here that LSU was very much in on with Bo Davis that are going, and they're going to have to reestablish kind of their thoughts on where those guys are at. I know we've heard from Lamar Brown, and yeah, he's put it on social media that LSU's still number one in his heart. So we'll see. I mean, it's show us before you tell us kind of thing. I think with recruiting these days, but
Yeah.
it's a fine balance you've got to walk there. But to me, I think it still just comes back to, do these players and do these recruits see that the players that are on the current roster are being developed by the next guy? Like, I think that could be a
Hmm.
big part of this too. Like, I mean, you bring in Bo Davis, who has all the cachet in the world and the past history. But there's just not a whole lot of other guys out there that have that, and the ones that do, are those programs are going to do what it takes to keep them there. So
Yeah.
it's a tough spot for LSU to be in right now, and they've got to figure that out. But that I think they can be aggressive with some of the top, what they perceive to be as the top defensive line coaching talent there is in the college game, and we'll see kind of what that produces here over the next week or two, or however long it takes for it to come to fruition.
Yeah, looking at the 2026 rankings just inside the state of Louisiana, you've got Lamar Brown there. You have Richard Anderson, the current commit, 6'3", 340. You obviously want to keep him in the fold there out of Edna Carr. And you feel good about, the relationship with Edna Carr there as well. Dylan Berryman, the fourth ranked player in the state, who did pick up a crystal ball to Texas. Just something to kind of keep an eye on there as well. And then obviously, as you get closer down the list, there in the eighth spot is Darius McKinley, who is he's a different type of player over there at Acadiana. So it's an interesting time. I think that you talked about a lot of good things there with just the recruiting aspect of it. You need you need the development, you need the recruiter, and you got to hit on this hire. I mean, when you just look at what is at stake here in 2025, Glenn, and we can round it out with this. Just it's really important. I think we've been talking for the past couple months about 2025 feels like a statement year for Brian Kelly in terms of his legacy at LSU, in terms of his tenure at LSU, and not hinting that there could be a coaching change in the end of the year or anything like that. But I think it is truly telling about a guy that you could have, um, you know, I don't want to say it, kind of on the fence of like how people feel about it. If you make the playoff, then hey, that's awesome. If not, then more questions start to arise about his longevity in Baton Rouge. So I think it's interesting. Kind of any
I mean,
final thoughts on just how much that impacts maybe his legacy as LSU's head coach?
if we frame it that way, if you look at year 4 and LSU is still not in the college football playoff or in that picture, um, you will have gone nearly halfway into his contract and they have not made the
Mm,
playoff yet. That is an abject failure. If we're just being brutally honest, like they have to make the playoff this year. They have to start showing signs of growth as a program, and they were on the outskirts looking in this year. This past year, I think um, we saw maybe a little bit more balance between the offense and the defense in 2024 in terms of just where those units are, as opposed to being at the very, very high top of 2023 on
yeah,
offense and the very, very bottom of defense in 2023. But the defense has still got to get better. Offense has got to eliminate turnovers and certainly be a little bit more consistent in the run game. And I think ultimately this is going to come back to how much improvement can the defense show. Can the defense be
hmm
uh, go from a top 60 group to a top 30 group or a top
yeah,
35 group? And if they can, I think you're going to like the results if you're LSU, because I do think the offense is going to be able to put up enough points and move the ball consistently to warrant winning a lot of these big games that LSU is going to be playing this year. But it's got to start with the defense. It's got to start with getting that hire made, and I would assume as swiftly as possible if you're LSU, to try to maybe get him in to coach these guys up a little bit in the spring, or at least start to develop those relationships in the spring. Because then you go into the summer and you're allowed to be around the program and whatnot, but you're just not going to have that on field experience
yeah.
really until the fall. So, um, that'll be interesting to watch as well. So, how swiftly LSU wants to get this thing done. Maybe by the time y'all are listening to this podcast, we have some more information on where LSU's looking and all that stuff. But yeah, it's a very critical next couple weeks for LSU, and certainly getting this roster of newcomers. They have 40 new players between the spring and summer enrollees that they have to get infused into this program. And defensive line and in particular defensive tackle has a lot of new young freshman talent that's already on campus that are very much in limbo right now about where who's going to be coaching them and kind of what that is going to
Yeah.
look like. So
Yeah, which is why I think it was a good thing they immediately had that meeting yesterday, sit them down. And that's how you obviously want to do that. You don't want these kids figuring out on social media or anything like that. But it does set up for an interesting spring ball, right? Like we get to kind of see who's working with who and what it looks like and the attitude. And obviously we'll have all that coverage starting next week. What is it, a week from tomorrow, Glenn? We're recording this on Friday, publishing it. What for spring ball starts on Saturday.
they start on
Um,
March 8th, but we don't get access until March 12th. So it might even be a little lot past
a little
that
bit later.
where we get to actually dive into some things and keep y'all updated on who's out there and what, you know, who are maybe some guys that are standing out to us. So
Gonna be here soon. Spring football right around the corner. We'll obviously be back with our baseball podcast on Sunday afternoon, evening, and into Monday. Big weekend in Frisco. Big game today against Kansas State, who knocked off 3 top 25 teams last week, and the Tigers fresh off a big win against Dallas Baptist over in Arlington on Wednesday. So lots of great coverage and a good reason for you to come join the community over at Go 24/7. Make sure you obviously subscribe to the YouTube channel. Check us out on all those podcast feeds. But come enjoy the written content in the great Go 24/7 community over there as well, and talk with us. We'll have a great conversation. We'll have a lot of fun. And Glenn will also share Glenn, I don't know if you knew you said this, but I noticed Glenn's frustrated. I am as well, as kids of the early 2000s about the remake of Shrek. And Glenn did say early in the podcast, peeling back the layer an onion. And you did say that. I don't know if you picked that up, but I thought that was pretty unique. So no,
I
but
like
come and
that
join with us. We
boulder.
talk everything.
That's a nice boulder.
I'm clipping that. I'm definitely clipping that, and that's going to be used on the site. So, hey, he is Glen West. My name is Bryce Koon. Thanks so much for tuning in. Bo Davis leaves LSU, heads to the New Orleans Saints, and we'll have more coverage of that in the days to come. We'll catch you next time here on the Go 24/7 podcast.